Jericho more intact? We can frame this reply as a dilemma. Suppose that we say that the value of the Jerichoites at stake in the argument is some anthropocentric conception of value, whether objectively or subjectively characterized, some sort of value that's centered around human beings, human interests, human form of life, and so forth. It would be bizarre to claim that some instance of divine agency is ipso facto defective because it is a failure to act optimally with respect to anthropocentric goodness, just as it would be bizarre to claim that some instance of human agency is defective because it is a failure to act optimally with respect to goldfish-centric goodness, kudzu vine-centric goodness, or amoeba-centric goodness. On the other hand, suppose that we say that the value of the Jerichoites at stake in the argument is some non-anthropocentric conception of value, say the sort of intrinsic value that G.E. Moore championed. While there may be plausible arguments that what makes for anthropocentric goodness must be in principle knowable by human beings, right? It's goodness for us. It's got to be the kind of things that can be within our ken. There's no plausible argument that what makes for some sort of intrinsic, non-anthropocentric goodness must be in principle knowable by human beings. One might reply here that an appeal to skepticism regarding the sorts of goods and evils in light of which God is acting in ordering the destruction of Jericho flies in the face that we are given via divine revelation an account of the precise reasons for that destruction, that the Jerichoites, through their wickedness, have defiled the land, and of course, relatedly, that the Israelites are not to get mixed up with these people. Once we are given the reasons, we can see that the means employed, the total destruction of the Jerichoites, are obviously disproportionate to these objectives, and so we gain no purchase in our defense of God's order to destroy Jericho. But I am not moved from my skepticism by the citing of these reasons. No doubt that in making intelligible God's command, we should advert to the wickedness of the Jerichoite community and should view God's command as in some way a response to that wickedness. But that is perfectly compatible with our having only the dimmest sense of the goods that are involved in God's directing the army of the Lord as he did, and the evils that may be involved with God's taking alternative courses of action. There have been some replies to the skeptical theist reflections on the problem of evil that retort that the truth of these reflections would undercut ordinary human agency. These replies have merit only to the extent that our ordinary human agency is appropriately regulated by estimates of non-anthropocentric value to be realized in and through action. As far as I can see, there's no reason to think that such value makes a difference to what I owe my fellow human beings as a matter of justice. And other virtues, temperance, courage, benevolence, and so forth, seem to be oriented by ordinary anthropocentric value. I think that it is true that, to the extent that ordinary human agency is to be regulated by non-anthropocentric value, the skeptical theist's view would undermine that agency. But there is little reason to suppose that this is an objection either to the skeptical theist's position on the problem of evil or to my position on the normative assessment of divine action. Our question reduces then, I hope, to that of whether God wronged the Jerichoites in the ordering of their destruction. I say that God did not wrong them, as there are certain preconditions that must hold for one party to wrong another, and those preconditions do not hold by nature in the case of God and human beings. My argument here consists in a set of considerations concerning two recent attempts to elucidate the nature of wronging, one by Stephen Darwall, one by Michael Thompson, both with respect to the plausibility of those recent attempts and their bearing on the case at issue. In the interest of time, and because Professor Morrison's comments do not address my criticisms of Darwall, I'm going to skip past those, and I will turn immediately to Thompson's view. So if you skip to the bottom of page 9 in my pagination, that'll take you to where I'm headed. So without claiming to offer anything like a full theory of wronging, I don't think anybody has a full theory of wronging that's at all adequate. Michael Thompson has offered in his rich discussion of the topic a couple of very plausible necessary conditions of wronging, the implications of which I want to draw out here. For one party to wrong another, these two must belong to the same decayological order. Okay? But it's not sufficient for two to belong to this common normative order that the rules by which they are bound have a common content. They must also have a common source. Consider how plausible this is with respect to one sort of minor decayological order, that found in games. What is necessary for me to cheat you in a game is, among other things, of course, that we're playing the same game. But to be the same game is not merely a matter of the qualitative character of the norms being followed, but also something about its origin, the community of players, the norm acceptance of which makes for that game, and so forth. Suppose that on one side of a mountain range we play marbles. On the other side of the mountain range, y'all play schmarbles. You call it marbles, though, interestingly. There's no common history, no interaction of any sort between these two communities. I have the marbles and you have the schmarbles meet on the mountaintop. admire each other's set of schmarbles, and commence to flicking our small spheres of glass at other of our small spheres of glass inside a circle marked in the dirt. The problem is that we're not playing a game. I'm trying to play marbles with you. You're trying to play schmarbles with me. I cannot cheat you at marbles. You're not playing marbles. I can't cheat you at schmarbles. Pardon me. I can't treat you at marbles. You're not playing marbles. I cannot treat you at schmarbles. I'm not playing schmarbles. There's no game at which I'm cheating you. Okay? We're not under a common order tied together by a set of rules. Any objection to my conduct, right, in terms of wronging, can stick only by moving outside of the order of the game to some order that we do share, say that of our common humanity, in which my attempts to deceive or manipulate you are themselves marked as wrongs. So the first constraint that an account of wronging must meet is that if one party can wrong another, the norms by which they are bound must have a common source. The second of these is that sharing a decayological order involves mutuality, as folks under such an order are linked together normatively. Thompson thinks that this entails that those parties who are linked by relations of right have to, in the normal cases, be capable of grasping and acting on the concept of right of that order. There's no decayological order, Thompson argues, unless the inability to grasp that order becomes extraordinary rather than ordinary. We cannot make sense of a class of persons being subject to such an order without the general capacity of those subject to it to act on it. Those under the rules of chess are characteristically able to grasp its rules. Those under the law of the United States are characteristically able to follow its norms, and so forth. This is what gives plausibility to the idea that adequate promulgation is essential to legal orders. It also gives plausibility to publicity constraints that some writers impose on constraints on accounts of justice. It, of course, does not follow that everyone under a normative order grasps the rules that link him or her to others within that order. A novice can be fully bound by the rules of chess, and a child fully bound by the rules of justice. But it cannot be in the ordinary run of things that the standard member of the group under a decayological order cannot grasp its norms. Suppose that we allow that these are genuine constraints on decayological orders. The question is whether it's plausible that there is a decayological order naturally shared by God and human beings that would make possible God's wronging the Jerichoites. But it seems to me that even without a full theory of wronging, the concession that these are necessary conditions on the presence of such an order renders implausible the view that God and the Jerichoites naturally share a decayological order. God and humans share such an order only if they are linked by a set of norms that have a common source. But it's unclear how this is to be. Thompson notes that it's very implausible that the form of rational agency is itself such a source. Abstractly considered, the form of rational agency is exhibited by corporations and by teams, not beings to whom we take ourselves to be bound by ties of justice. Indeed, any attempt to argue that there is naturally a set of norms to which both God and humans are subject, and thus which can tie us to God as a matter of justice, is open to the following difficulty. The justice under which we act is essentially constraining. It binds us, setting limits to our action. Even if there were a will that naturally and necessarily cleaves to what is just, a Kantian holy will informed by a grace that ensures compliance with the norms of justice, what we are describing is a will that acts within constraints set by justice. But I take it that what we may call God's justice is not something that's essentially constraining. It's neither true that God experiences the norms of justice as constraints on God's willing, nor that God's will is simply necessarily such that it never goes contrary to those constraints. Our decayological order is something that those under it are subjected to. God is not naturally subjected to anything. So I cannot see that we and God are both under a common form of justice. So there's one worry arising from the common source constraint. But there's also a worry arising from the conceptual grasp constraint. This constraint is that for those who are under decayological order, inability to grasp the contours of that order must be extraordinary. Think about what this would entail. It would entail that any norms of justice in which God is naturally linked to created rational beings would be limited in their complexity to what the dimmest kind of rational being can characteristically grasp. What affirming the possibility of wronging in these cases would mean is that God is ex ante, constrained by a form of justice that binds those of the meagerest intelligence and agency along with any more exalted. It seems perverse that this would be true, that the form of justice to which a perfect God would be subject would be constrained by the limits on the agency of the most meager kind of created rational being. So I have been arguing that God and humans do not by nature share a decayological order, and that it is only in sharing such an order that the possibility of wronging arises. It follows from this that God did not wrong the Jerichoites in ordering the destruction of their city. As I argued in section 3, the claim that God wronged the Jerichoites is the only plausible route to the conclusion that God acted wrongly with respect to them. So I say that we lack a rational basis to hold that God acted wrongly with respect to the Jerichoites. Now, one might think that the view that I've described is too strong. One might. For as implications of God and wronging that we have reason to reject, even apart from concerns about God's relation to the Jerichoites. Skip the next paragraph and go on. One might claim, for example, that this view proves too much with respect to God's relationship to human justice. For one might claim that the view that I've defended rules out not only the bare logical possibility of God's having wronged the Jerichoites in the destruction of Jericho, it also rules out the possibility of God's ever wronging anyone, right? Not on substantive moral grounds, say on the basis of God's being a perfectly good being, but on grounds of the logic of wronging. But we want to say, don't we, that God is a lover of justice. And we want to say, don't we, that God is just, perfectly so, and that if, for example, God had told the Israelites that the walls of Jericho would come down if they followed his bidding, and the walls did not come down, that God would have wronged the Israelites.